thanks for joining us this morning for coffee and cladograms. Well, I mean, I'll have the coffee, you have the cladograms.
Sounds amazing. Let's get going. So cladograms, or phylogenetic trees, or phylogenies, or whatever you want to call them, are very important tool used in a lot of fields of biology, evolution, genetics, you name it. It's in everything. So unfortunately you can run away from this, so you might as well learn it, and we're gonna do our best to teach it to you. So basically a phylogenetic tree is just a picture representing the way the scientist thinks a group of species are related to each other.
And they used to do this by appearance, but now it's become so much more important to use things like genetics and other factors.
Love genetics.
Or other, like, you know, molecular analyses things. So taxa are just groupings of things together based on like how much they're related to each other. Like if they're really related to each other, you might look at like the species or the genus taxa. If you want to talk about something more general, like all of mammals, then you would use like that taxa.
It doesn't have to be just one species, it's just a group, an arbitrarily designed group. And of course you want to have a taxa that makes sense, but it's pretty much whatever goes. Now there are special type of taxa called sister taxa, which are pretty much the two taxa that are most closely related in a tree. Now there doesn't have to be just one group of sister taxa. For example, say we say A and B are sister taxa. You track their most recent common ancestor, and they're the only two taxa branching off from that common ancestor. So A and B are sister taxa. Now it doesn't only have to be one taxon, it can be a group. So for example, if I say A and B and C and D, you go to their most recent common ancestor, and then those two groups are also sister taxa.
So this is where it makes sense to call this system cladistics, because when you're talking about a clade, you're talking about monophyletic groups. You see where in the box, you're looking at just one ancestor and everything that descended out of it.
So an example of a monophyletic group, you just say F and G, and their most recent common ancestor is right here. So if you include the most recent common ancestor and you include all of its descendants, then that's automatically a clade or a monophyletic group. So let's look at another example.
So then you could draw the circle around D, E, F, and G, and as long as you include the node between where D kind of meets E, as long as you include that ancestor, then you've still made a monophyletic group.
There are more than one ways to draw the same phylogenetic tree. In this case, we've gone back and redrawn the same phylogenetic tree we were just looking at into a different shape. Now, the way you check if it is the same phylogenetic tree is you look at all of the nodes. If all of the nodes are joining the same taxa, then it's considered a monophyletic group. Remember, you follow the node both ways, and if the two sister taxa are the same, then you're in good shape. So let's look at a first monophyletic group that we looked at before. So this would be the node we're going to focus on.
And to make it a monophyletic group, you want to draw around F and G.
Exactly. Okay, now if we pick this common ancestor, what would make it a monophyletic group?
If you drew around G, F, E, and D.
Now, there's one more thing that we want to mention before we move on. If you look at all the way back here, the most recent common ancestor of the whole tree would be this node that we have highlighted. So that node branches off into A and everything else. So who is most closely related to A according to this phylogeny?
It would look like B, wouldn't it?
But is it really? Think about what we've talked about of sister taxa. Just follow the branch. What does the branch tell you? Does the branch actually go to B?
And only exclusively B.
Or does it encompass every other group that's not A?
So it does lead to all the other branches, and this is actually saying that A is just as closely related to B as to everybody else.
Exactly. And you will get this question a lot. So just go to the node and then follow the node. There is just 2 taxa. It never joins more than 2. If it does, then there's something wrong with the tree. It's actually called a polytomy. It's a mistake. It means you don't know what's the relationship between those three organisms. So A is equally related to B, C, D, E, F, and G. That makes sense to you guys?
Okay, so let's see if you get this. So is this a monophyletic group? Yeah. So you've got your most recent shared common ancestor and both A and B as your descendants inside the box. Let's draw another box. So what about this one? Is this monophyletic? Not quite, because there's something missing. So let me just redraw the box. So you'll notice that that missing thing was actually D. Now that we've got A, B, C, and D, and the red dot where the node is, now we've made a monophyletic group. So see? Old version, new version.
Okay, so what we drew in this red box actually does have a name, and it's a paraphyletic group, and we're going to talk about it right now.
So paraphyletic is what you saw when you didn't include all the descendants that came from the ancestor that you were looking at.
Look at a very, very famous example of a paraphyletic group, and that is the group of reptiles, or traditionally defined reptiles include your crocodiles, which are pretty self-explanatory. That's your crocodiles, alligators, and caimans. Then you have your lepidosaurs, which are your lizards with overlapping scales. That's where you have most of your lizards, and snakes are included in there too. And the chelonia are turtles. So this is what commonly defined reptiles used to be. Now, recent genetic studies have shown that birds are very, very closely related to crocodiles.
But they're not something you would really most times call a reptile.
Right. But if you look at the most recent common ancestor that I've just drawn here, it does share a most recent common ancestor, and to make this a monophyletic group, you cannot, or a clade, you cannot leave aves out. You need to include avians in the group to actually make it a natural monophyletic group. So you have your most recent common ancestor, and it includes all of the descendants. Notice too that on the picture that's before, the red shaded area, the green shaded area does not include mammals either, but it does include all amniotes. So it's kind of weird the way it was drawn. So if you want a monophyletic group and a clade out of reptiles, you have to include birds. Isn't that cool? Another very famous paraphyletic group, and one that I'm very passionate about, is great apes. So great apes are commonly defined as orangutans, gorillas, bonobos, and chimpanzees, and their respective subspecies, leaving out humans. Now, looking at it only from a phylogenetic point of view, if you go to their most recent common ancestor, which is the hominidia, you would have to redraw your clade to include humans too for it to actually be a clade. Remember, I talked about monophyletic groups before, and if you leave humans out, it's not really a clade. It becomes a paraphyletic group. Now, I'm not going to argue for or against it, but you have the information, so you make your own decisions. Are humans apes?
Continue exploring at your own
leisure.
Yep.
Have fun.
Okay, so up to now we've talked about, well, monophyletic groups, and those are like the groups that include everybody, ancestors and descendants. It's like the big families, and even though they're big, they still remember all their kids. Then we had paraphyletic, where it was the parents, like the ancestors, and most of everybody, but then they had to go back and make sure that last kid was in the car with them. Then this last big term that we want to go over is polyphyletic, and this is when all the kids are together, but you don't talk about the ancestors.
So just to recap, monophyletic group has the most recent common ancestor and all of its living descendants. A paraphyletic group has the most recent common ancestor, but not all of its living descendants. So it's leaving some descendants out. And a polyphyletic group has one common ancestor and all of its living descendants, but it has an extra taxa in there, and it does not have all of the common ancestors of that one, so it's leaving ancestors out.
So it's kind of like when you go away to college and you're mingling with more than just your usual group, and it's like, oh, parents are kind of the backstory.
So for polyphyletic groups, remember at the beginning of the video when Tyler was saying that phylogenetic trees used to be based off of similarities before? So let's, for example, take the mollusks, which I've shown a tree up in here, and just take off gastropods and bivalves, which have that like hard shell around them. It would make a lot of sense if you're just going off of similarities to group them with crabs, because they kind of look alike. They have a hard shell, they're semi-aquatic kind of thing, if you count the snails as like the out group. So it would make sense to actually make a tree like this. But in reality, gastropods and bivalves are part of mollusks, which are related to squid and to just polychaetes. Yeah.
Okay, so a different set of terms that we're going over. Now it's not just grouping, but it's now what are you looking for? What is it that pulls these groups together sometimes?
So instead of actually talking about the terms that we use to define taxa, we're going to talk about the terms we use to define traits.
A synapomorphy is when an ancestor, an animal, is going to have some traits, and then the descendants that come from its lineage will also have those traits.
Like so. So let's look at some examples of synapomorphies. Tyler, you want to talk about hair?
Sure, and we'll talk about hair as relates to, well, only relates to mammals. It's a synapomorphy for mammals because it's the only group that has hair, and all of them have hair because their ancestor had hair.
Remember that the synapomorphy refers to the trait. So even though we are talking about mammals, then we're talking about traits. So the synapomorphy is the presence of hair, not the group. So now another example is the amniotic egg. Now the amniotic egg, as you can see here, is a trait for which all of these organisms share. Even mammals do have an amniotic egg. They just don't, most mammals don't lay eggs. They sort of carry it inside them, and it doesn't have a hard shell. So the placenta and all that fun stuff, it's part of the amniotic egg. And let's talk about apomorphies and symplesiomorphies. Symplesiomorphy is A shared ancestral trait means it's a trait that hasn't been modified from the common ancestor.
Then apomorphy is it's when two closely related groups have the same trait, but the ancestor that they shared didn't have that trait.
So it's like a slightly modified trait, and they both modified it the same way. So an example of a Symplesiomorphy is a tail in most vertebrates. So we all have a bony tail. It's located after the anus, just like the three animals in this picture.
So then apomorphy would be when your ancestor had a tail, but then you and groups that are related to you don't have a tail anymore. Or you don't keep a tail for most of your lifetime.
Exactly. So even though it doesn't look like it, both humans and our gorilla over there have the vestige of a tail. So it's just the coccyx. It kind of looks like a tail, as a tailbone. So when you fall on your butt, it really hurts. That's your tailbone. And we do have a tail in our embryonic stages, though.
And then what we're left with is just that little triangle of bone.
Mm-hmm.
The coccyx.
Yes. Now, homoplasy is a trait that is shared by some taxa that's not present in the most recent common ancestor. So in here, we're talking more about parallel evolution. Like so.
So for something to be an homology, it's a trait that would have had to come from a shared ancestor, and the trait is used for the same function, and it's probably got the same structure or whatever fits it in both species that you're looking at.
And then an analogy is also a shared trait, but it is a trait that does not have a similar evolutionary origin. So it is a trait that two organisms have, but it didn't come from the same ancestor at all. It's just parallel evolution. It's just they face the same ecological challenges, so they develop similar adaptations, and they just happen to look alike.
So despite the different morphologies that you can see in different bird wings based on their species and their niche, since they're all wings and birds all have them, it's a homology. They all got them from the same common ancestor.
Now, if you're thinking about birds and bats' wings, they would be analogous, since birds, they're used for the same purpose. They're still for flying, but birds' wings evolved at a different time and from a different sort of structure than bat wings. So even though they're used for the same thing and they sort of look alike, and again goes back to how closely related the organisms are, even though they look alike. Now, if you stop looking at the wings in a certain as analogous traits, and you actually look at the forelimb as a forelimb, then that will be a homologous trait, because they do share the same morphology. They do share exactly the same bones. So you have the radius, the ulna, the phalanges, the tarsals, the carpals, the metacarpals, the humerus. They all have all of those. So at the level of forelimbs, they are homologous. You can see that a lot better in this image. You have a wider range of forelimbs, and they all share the same basic morphology, and they stem from the same basic bones. They've just been adapted to different functions, but even though they're all adapted for different functions and they might look very, very different to you, they are homologous traits because they share this ancestry and they still have the same components.